Welcome to the world of Dreamside Traveler. Here, beneath the soothing sound of gentle rain, we journey through time and space, uncovering the mysteries of the past and diving into the most captivating pages of human history. This place is created for those who love exploring the world in the quiet of evening, for those who value peace while yearning to discover something new before sleep. If you enjoy what you're hearing, please give this video a like. It helps other people find our stories. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers in our club of nighttime history lovers. And the Dreamside Traveler channel will become your faithful guide to sleep. We're constantly adding new stories for your peaceful evenings. And if you have ideas about which historical topics interest you, or simply want to share your thoughts, leave comments below the video. I'm genuinely curious to know what inspires you. Now close your eyes. Feel this gentle rain outside your window. Allow yourself to relax. Our journey begins right now. They say the stone walls of the Inquisitor's house have seen every kind of suffering, but the pain endured by women in these chambers is a special kind of hell, a place where shame is the first tool and dignity is stripped away long before the body is ever touched. For women, accusation is not only a threat to life, but a threat to the soul, the name, and everything that makes a person whole. It begins in the night, as it so often does. The village sleeps, the house is locked tight, children pressed to their mothers' sides. But for a certain group of men, officers in dark cloaks, faces shadowed, the night is only beginning. They move silently, guided by whispers, by the nervous finger of a jealous neighbor or the vengeful story of a spurned lover. It does not take much. Sometimes just being different, too beautiful, too clever, too old, or too young is enough. Tonight it is Maria. She is the widow of a stonemason, known in her village for her gentle touch, her knowledge of herbs, her habit of sitting by the river to wash her hands after sunset. For some, she is a comfort. For others, an oddity. When sickness sweeps the town and some children do not survive, suspicion turns to her. The priest, eager to calm the townsfolk, points to her home. Soon enough, the Inquisitors arrive. Maria is dragged from her bed before dawn, her nightgown torn, her hair a wild halo. She is not allowed to cover herself. The men laugh quietly as they bind her hands, their eyes lingering where they should not. The walk to the prison is long and humiliating, every step echoing with the judgment of those who watch from behind shutters and curtains. The cell where Maria is thrown is colder than she imagined. The first hours are a blur of fear and confusion. The guards jeer, make jokes, threaten her with stories of what happens to women accused of witchcraft. She is not given water, not given time to prepare, just left alone to shiver in her shame. When the questioning begins, it is not like what she has heard from others. The Inquisitor sits close, much too close, his voice a whisper meant for secrets, not truth. He asks about her body, her cycles, the herbs she uses. He asks if she has ever lain with the devil, if she has bewitched men, if she has touched herself at night or been touched by others in the moonlight. The questions are endless, every one more invasive, every one designed to make her doubt her own innocence. The chamber is full of eyes, the inquisitor, the scribe, the guards. Sometimes even other prisoners are brought in, forced to watch or listen. Maria's answers are written down in cruel, mocking language. When she cries, the inquisitor tells her that her tears are proof of guilt. When she begs for mercy, he leans in and tells her that only a confession will spare her worst torment. But the questioning is only the beginning. Soon, the threats become promises. The inquisitor produces the pear of anguish, the infamous instrument used for purifying women accused of secret sins. The device, heavy and cold, is described in loving detail. The inquisitor explains how it will be inserted, how the screw will be turned, how her body will be torn apart from the inside unless she admits everything. He asks her again, "Have you lain with the devil? Have you cursed a child? Have you used your body to tempt a priest?" Each question is a knife. Maria tries to hold onto her dignity, tries to remember the warmth of the sun, the laughter of her children. But the room is full of men who take pleasure in her humiliation. They watch her tears, her trembling, her silence, and they smile. The pear is used as a threat at first, waved in front of her eyes, pressed against her skin. Then, one morning, after a night spent sobbing into the straw, Maria is dragged into the torture chamber, and the device is forced inside her. The pain is blinding, a fire that travels up her spine and explodes behind her eyes. The men watch. The scribe records every scream, every confession torn from her lips. Maria admits to anything they want, that she danced naked by the river, that she met the devil in her dreams, that she poisoned the bread and bewitched the cows. It does not matter if it is true. The only truth is the pain, and all the while the humiliation never ends. After the torture, Maria is left exposed, her body bleeding, her mind fractured. She is not allowed to clean herself, not allowed to hide. Guards joke about her, call her names, spread rumors through the prison about what she confessed. The other women look away, afraid to draw attention. Even the nurses sent to tend her wounds are silent, their faces tight with fear. What the inquisitors do not say, what they do not write in their records, is that this kind of suffering does not end when the pain stops. The shame lives on, carried by the women who survive, by their daughters, by the entire village. Maria will never again walk through her town with her head held high. Even if she is freed, even if the inquisitors lose interest, she is forever changed. There are other women, too many to count. Each one accused for a different reason, each one made to suffer in ways designed to break the spirit as much as the body. Some are raped, the act justified as exorcism or cleansing. Others are paraded naked through the streets, their bodies marked with ash, their hair shorn as a sign of shame. Some are forced to confess against their sisters, their mothers, their friends. The inquisitors know that nothing destroys a woman faster than turning her against those she loves. And sometimes the worst pain is the isolation. The silence that follows the screams, the way the other prisoners avoid your eyes, the way even the kindest guard cannot meet your gaze. You become invisible, erased by your own suffering. You wonder if you are still human, if anyone could ever touch you again without flinching. In the darkest hours, Maria remembers the river, the feeling of water rushing over her hands, the sound of birds at dawn. She repeats those memories like prayers, clutching at them to keep from slipping away. She does not know if she will survive. She does not know if she wants to. But even as the Inquisitors try to destroy her, some small part of her refuses to die. There is a part of the chamber that is colder than the rest, a place where the stone never warms, not even in summer. This is where they keep the women who have confessed, or who are awaiting further judgment, a room filled with the sound of low breathing, of whispered prayers, of the quiet weeping that never quite stops. The women huddle together for warmth, but rarely for comfort. Everyone knows that any show of friendship might be twisted into an accusation, any kindness mistaken for conspiracy. Maria lies on her side, knees drawn to her chest, her mind drifting in and out of memory. She remembers the feel of river water, the sound of her mother's voice, the warmth of a sleeping child at her back. But each time she finds some small comfort, it is torn away by the memory of hands on her body, of laughter that was never kind, of the pair of anguish and the screams it pulled from her throat. The days blend together. Sometimes she is summoned for more questioning. Sometimes she is left alone for what feels like forever. The Inquisitor always finds new ways to invade her mind. He asks about her dreams, about her body, about the times she bled, about the lovers she never had. He demands names of other women, presses her to describe acts she never committed. Every answer is written down, every hesitation interpreted as guilt. If she tries to explain, if she pleads, the Inquisitor grows impatient, his voice turning cruel. Other women in the chamber tell similar stories, each unique, but all bound by the same thread of shame and humiliation. There is Isabella, who was accused after the priest saw her laughing with a stranger in the square. There is Catalina, a widow who owns a small patch of land and has no brothers or sons to defend her. There is Lucia, young and beautiful, envied by other girls, watched too closely by men. All of them bear scars, some visible, some buried so deep that no one will ever see them. One night, Maria is shaken awake by a guard who smells of wine and sweat. He drags her into a narrow corridor, muttering about new evidence, about a test that will prove her guilt or innocence. She is marched past closed doors, past the echo of her own footsteps, into a room lit by a single torch. There are men waiting, not just the Inquisitor and his scribe, but two others, unfamiliar faces, their eyes shining with anticipation. The test is a mockery of justice. Maria is forced to strip, to stand naked as the men circle her, looking for devil's marks, for scars or birthmarks that could be declared proof of witchcraft. The scribe records every detail, every shudder, every plea for mercy. The Inquisitor prods her with a metal rod, lifting her hair, spreading her fingers, demanding explanations for every freckle, every bruise. They debate among themselves, discussing her body as if she were a piece of livestock to be judged at market. Maria tries to disappear inside herself, to become nothing but air and silence. But the pain and shame are too strong. When she is finally allowed to dress, her hands shake so badly she can barely tie her shift. She is led back to her cell, but the humiliation lingers. clinging to her skin like the smell of smoke. The next morning, the Inquisitor returns, smiling as if nothing has happened. He tells her that if she confesses to new charges, if she names other women, if she admits to meeting with the devil, if she describes the details of her supposed crimes, she will be given leniency. He offers her a chance at forgiveness, but only if she gives them what they want. The threat is always there, unspoken but heavy. More pain, more shame, more nights spent exposed to the laughter of men who think themselves righteous. Maria refuses at first. She clings to her silence, even as the other women in the chamber begin to avoid her, whispering that she is making things worse for everyone. The Inquisitors know this too. They start to punish not just her, but those who are seen speaking with her, sharing food, sitting too close. The isolation grows. Maria begins to feel she is disappearing, that even the other prisoners blame her for their suffering. The days grow darker, both in the cell and in Maria's heart. Food becomes scarce. Water is rationed. The guards joke about what will happen next, about how many more women will confess before the Inquisitors move on to the next village. Sometimes a woman is taken away and does not return. Sometimes one is brought back, bleeding, too broken to speak. One night Maria is awakened again. This time it is not the guards but Isabella shaking her shoulder. "Do not let them take your name," Isabella whispers, her voice hoarse. "They can have everything else, but not your name." It is the first real kindness Maria has heard in weeks, and it brings tears she cannot hide. But even small kindness can be dangerous. The next day, Isabella is accused of conspiring with Maria. The two are brought into the chamber together, forced to stand back to back as the Inquisitor lists their supposed crimes. The pair of anguish is placed on the table between them, a threat more powerful than any words. The men demand that each accuse the other, that they give up secrets, that they describe in detail the devil's work they performed together. It is a game designed to break the bond between women, to turn compassion into danger. Maria and Isabella refuse to betray each other. The punishment is swift. They are both paraded through the prison, their hair shorn, their bodies marked with ash. The guards force them to kneel in the courtyard while others throw rotten food and insults. The humiliation is meant to be worse than the pain. A warning to every woman who dares to stand with another. For some, this is the breaking point. Catalina, watching from the shadows, later tells Maria that she no longer believes she will survive. "We are not people to them," Catalina whispers. "We are lessons." The realization is almost worse than the torture itself. Sometimes the Inquisitors use more than just devices or threats. There are stories, too, of exorcisms gone wrong, of rituals meant to cleanse women of their sins that become excuses for assault. The priests claim that the devil must be driven out through the body. And in doing so, they claim the right to touch, to hurt, to violate. Some women are left with bruises, others with wounds that never heal, some with children born of violence. The chamber is full of stories, none of them written down, none of them spoken aloud, except in the whispers that pass from woman to woman in the dark. There is no justice here, no mercy, only the slow grind of shame and pain and the hope that somehow there will be an end. For Maria, the end comes not with a release, but with a change. She stops answering questions. She stops pleading for mercy. She sits in the corner of the cell, clutching the memory of her name, her mother's voice, the river at dawn. The inquisitors grow bored, frustrated. Eventually, they move on, looking for new victims, new confessions. Maria is left behind, a shell of herself, but not completely broken. The scars remain, both on her body and in her heart. But even as she struggles to survive, even as she wonders if she will ever be whole again, she clings to the tiny acts of kindness that remain, the whispered words, the shared piece of bread, the hand that reaches out in the dark. There is no clock in the women's prison, but the passage of time becomes something you feel in your bones. Days bleed into nights, seasons shift, but inside the walls, everything is the same shade of gray. Maria marks the passing hours not by sunlight or church bells, but by the sounds of keys turning, the approach of heavy boots, the sharp click of the latch on the iron door. Sometimes she counts her own heartbeats, just to remind herself she is alive. Word spreads quickly in the darkness, carried on whispers and glances. A new arrival always brings fresh tension. One day, a girl named Inez is thrown into the chamber, her dress torn, her eyes wide with the shock of betrayal. She is only 16, accused because she was seen gathering wild herbs alone at dusk. The guards laugh as they push her inside, joking about the witch's apprentice, about how she will learn soon enough what happens to girls who do not obey. Maria, Isabella, and the other women make space for Inez, but there is little comfort to offer. Inez is trembling, arms wrapped around her knees, her voice thin as spider silk. When she finally speaks, it is to ask if her mother knows where she is, if anyone is coming to save her. Maria wants to lie, to offer some hope, but the words die in her throat. She knows that hope is a dangerous thing in this place. The next day, Inez is summoned by the Inquisitor. The guards come at dawn, their faces shadowed by torchlight. They drag her down the corridor, her cries echoing through the stone, a sound that makes every woman flinch. Hours pass. When Inez is returned, her face is white as linen, her lips bloody. She will not speak of what happened, but the marks on her body tell enough. That night, she does not sleep, and the others keep silent out of respect and fear. Humiliation becomes routine. Every woman in the chamber is forced to submit to examinations, to prove her innocence by exposing her body to the cold gaze of strangers. The Inquisitors invent new accusations each time, twisting every word and gesture. If a woman protests, she is beaten. If she weeps, she is mocked. If she tries to hide, the guards drag her into the hall by her hair, stripping her bare before the other prisoners as a lesson. Maria loses count of how many times she is forced to kneel before the Inquisitor, to answer questions about her body, her thoughts, her private life. The questions are always the same, but the meaning shifts. Have you lain with a demon? Have you bewitched a man with your body? Have you allowed yourself pleasure, even in secret? The shame of these questions is almost worse than the pain. Maria's skin burns with humiliation long after the interrogations end. Some nights the guards come for no reason at all. They choose a woman at random and take her away, returning her hours later, shaking and silent. Sometimes the woman does not return at all. The threat hangs over everyone like a cloud, impossible to predict or escape. In the darkness, the women share their stories. Each one is different, but all are woven with the same threads of loss and fear. Catalina, once a proud landowner, tells how her neighbors turned on her, accusing her of using her beauty to cast spells. Lucia describes how her own brother denounced her, desperate to save himself. Isabella confesses that she once believed the Inquisitors were truly seeking the truth, but now knows they only want pain, only want to break what they cannot control. As weeks turn into months, small acts of resistance begin to grow. The women develop a secret code, 3 taps on the wall for comfort, a folded piece of bread for friendship, a whispered blessing in the dark. Maria learns to hide her emotions behind a mask, to answer questions with silence or half-truths. She helps Inez, showing her how to stay invisible, how to keep her mind from unraveling. These tiny rebellions are the only thing that make life bearable, but the Inquisitors know how to punish even these small comforts. One day, they discover a piece of bread passed from Maria to Inez. The punishment is swift and brutal. Maria is dragged into the courtyard, stripped and tied to a post. The guards mock her, call her a whore, a witch, a corrupter of children. They beat her until she can no longer stand, then leave her there, bleeding and exposed, while the other prisoners watch in horror. When she is finally released, her body is covered in bruises, her spirit battered but not broken. Inez, terrified by what happened to Maria, withdraws into herself. She stops eating, stops speaking, curls into a corner of the cell and does not move for days. Maria and the others do what they can, sharing what little food they have, whispering words of encouragement. But the damage is done. Inez is a shadow of herself, and the chamber is quieter than ever. There are rumors, always, of worse things happening in other prisons. Women raped by guards and priests in the name of exorcism, forced pregnancies used as evidence of union with the devil. Some are forced to bear children alone in the cell, the babies taken away as soon as they are born. Others are told that only a full confession will spare their children's lives, or that their daughters will be taken in their place if they do not cooperate. Maria cannot count how many times she has seen a woman break under the pressure. Sometimes it happens suddenly, with a scream and a flood of words. Other times it is slow, a gradual collapse into silence and despair. But always, the Inquisitors watch with satisfaction, writing everything down, collecting confessions like trophies. One evening, an old woman named Rosa, who has survived more than anyone thought possible, tells a story as the others drift toward uneasy sleep. She says that in her village, long before the Inquisitors came, women would gather by the river every full moon to share food and laughter, to sing and tell stories. They believed that as long as they remembered each other's names, no one could truly be lost. Maria holds onto this story, repeating the names of the women around her every night, even as the chamber grows colder and the days grow shorter. The chamber is not only a place of pain and shame. It is a place where the memory of what it means to be a woman is slowly worn away. The Inquisitors want you to forget that you are a daughter, a sister, a mother, a friend. They want you to believe you are nothing but a body to be used and discarded, a name to be erased from the world. But Maria refuses. Every morning, she wakes and whispers the names of those she loves, refusing to let them fade. Sometimes a woman is released. More often, she is sent away for execution, her fate unknown to the others. The guards never say where or why. The Inquisitors never explain. The only constant is the sound of the iron door, the flicker of torchlight, the heavy silence that follows every act of violence. And yet, there are moments when the world outside creeps in, a snatch of birdsong through a crack in the wall, a glimpse of sky during a march to the courtyard. Maria cherishes these moments, holding them close like treasures. She knows that no matter what the Inquisitors do, there is a world beyond the prison, a world where women still gather by rivers, where stories are still told, where hope survives, even if only in secret. She dreams of freedom, not just for herself, but for every woman who has suffered, every girl who has learned to fear the night. She dreams of a day when the names whispered in the darkness will be shouted in the sunlight, when the shame and pain will be replaced by healing and memory. Until that day comes, Maria endures, her spirit battered but unbroken, her heart holding tight to the names that make her who she is. In the records of the Inquisition, every victim is a case number, a folder, a set of signatures and accusations. Yet behind each name there is a life, and behind each trial a ripple of fear that travels far beyond the walls of the court. The process was designed to be thorough and merciless, a lesson for all who watched. But even centuries later, the stories of the most haunting cases have not lost their sting. They survive in fragments, a signature on brittle parchment, a whispered rumor in a village, a memorial stone by a forgotten road. Take the case of Francisco Maldonado, a young tailor in Toledo. His story begins not with a crime, but with an argument. He quarrels with a rival in the marketplace, a dispute over cloth and customers. The rival, seeking revenge, whispers to a visiting friar that Francisco has spoken against the faith, that he keeps strange books in his home, that he is seen out late at night. The friar, eager to prove his vigilance, passes the rumor to the local inquisitor. The process begins before Francisco even knows he is in danger. Early one morning, Francisco is taken from his shop, bound and led through the cobbled streets. Neighbors watch from behind shutters, some whispering prayers, others turning away. He is held for 3 days before the first interrogation, during which time he is not told the charges, only that he has enemies in high places. The inquisitors ask about his friends, his habits, his opinions about sermons in the cathedral. He answers honestly, thinking that truth will protect him. But the Inquisition does not want the truth, it wants confirmation of its suspicions. The friar is called to testify. He repeats his story, now more confident, adding details. Francisco's own apprentice, terrified and desperate, is brought in and told that unless he cooperates, he too will be accused. In the official document, the boy says he saw his master with a forbidden text, It is enough. Francisco is declared suspect of heresy. The process is carefully choreographed. Francisco is moved to a cold cell, his clothes taken, his food rationed. He is questioned at length, always with the same questions, the same accusations, until he begins to question his own memory. Did he ever say something careless in the tavern? Did he once laugh at a priest's mistake? Did he ever, in anger, say a word that could be twisted against him? At the heart of the case is the search for evidence. Francisco's house is ransacked. A Bible in Latin, a book of herbal remedies, a letter from a cousin in France, all become objects of suspicion. Each item is catalogued, added to the record, and shown to Francisco as proof of his guilt. The inquisitors point to passages, asking for explanations, demanding to know why he owns books not approved by the church. Francisco explains that the remedies are for his mother, that the letter is about trade, but no one listens. The process is about control, not understanding. When he is finally brought before the public, Francisco stands pale and trembling, his hands shaking as the accusations are read aloud. The crowd watches in silence, some pitying, some eager for a spectacle. The inquisitors ask again for confession. Francisco refuses, insisting he is innocent. The punishment is severe. A public penance, a march through the streets with a sign declaring his shame, and a month in the prison beneath the court. But it does not end there. The stigma follows him after his release. He returns to find his shop looted, his apprentice gone, his reputation in ruins. Neighbors avoid him, afraid to be seen speaking to someone marked by the Inquisition. He spends the rest of his days in the shadows, a ghost in his own city, forever wondering which careless word sealed his fate. Other cases are even more chilling for their randomness. There is the story of Juana Sanchez, a midwife from Seville. She is accused by the parents of a stillborn child, desperate to find someone to blame. The inquisitors demand that Juana reveal the names of other women who practice her art, twisting every healing act into evidence of witchcraft. The official record of her trial is a litany of humiliations. She is forced to describe her methods in front of a crowd of men, stripped and searched for marks, subjected to the ordeal of water and the threat of the pair. She confesses at last, not because she is guilty, but because she can bear no more shame. Her confession does not save her. She is sentenced to life in prison, her property confiscated, her name passed down in whispers as a warning to other women. Years later, documents show that the same accusations were leveled against dozens of midwives across Spain. Each case a carbon copy of Juana's, each ending in ruin. The case of Samuel Baruch, a merchant of Jewish heritage in Valencia, is even more tragic. Samuel is careful, cautious, attends Mass, keeps his business affairs clean. But in a season of famine and unrest, old suspicions resurface. A child in the city falls ill, and the rumor spreads that Samuel's family brought bad luck. One night, soldiers arrive at his door. He and his wife are taken away, their children left with strangers. The interrogation is brutal. Samuel is accused not just of heresy, but of sorcery, of Judaizing, of consorting with enemies of the faith. Under torture, Samuel tries to protect his wife, confessing to anything the Inquisitors want. She too is tortured, but she does not break. In the records, her testimony is described as defiant and proud, her refusal to name others seen as evidence of her guilt. In the end, both are condemned, their property taken by the city, their children left to beg for food. The documents show that Samuel's confession was used as proof against several other families. The cycle of accusation widening with every case. One of the most notorious cases is that of Blanca Romero, a noblewoman in Zaragoza. Unlike most victims, Blanca is educated, wealthy, with powerful friends. She speaks out against corruption in the local parish and soon finds herself denounced by a rival noble. The charge is vague, scandalous conduct, dangerous ideas, association with known heretics. The trial drags on for months, with witnesses brought in from distant towns, evidence assembled from rumors and slander. Blanca defends herself fiercely, her testimony recorded in pages of careful, passionate handwriting. But the Inquisitors are relentless. In the end, she is sentenced to house arrest, her fortune seized, her reputation forever tainted. The stories never follow the same script, but the ending is always similar. The Inquisition moves through lives like a scythe, cutting down the bold, the unlucky, the different. Its strength lies not only in its prisons and torture chambers, but in the way it turns suspicion into a weapon, teaching communities to fear their own neighbors. Even centuries later, the names echo in the records: Francisco, Juana, Samuel, Blanca. Each case is a map of suffering and betrayal, a lesson in how easily a life can be destroyed by fear and accusation. The Inquisition's records are filled with names that now feel like distant echoes. But for those who lived through the accusations, the terror was immediate and consuming. The process was never a single event, but a slow, creeping erosion of everything that made a person whole. In the city of Cordoba, there is a record from the spring of 1642 describing the case of Clara Estrella, a widow whose only crime was refusing to remarry and keeping her late husband's books in a wooden chest beneath her bed. Clara had always been an independent woman, respected in her neighborhood for her skill at weaving and for her kindness to stray animals and children. For many years, she kept to herself, her only company a black cat and a handful of aging neighbors who remembered her as a girl. Her life might have passed quietly had it not been for the bad harvest and a rash of illnesses among the children that spring. Fear found an easy target, and the whispers started. Clara was a witch. Her husband had died in suspicious circumstances. The cat was a demon in disguise. It began with small things. One day, she found a cross painted on her door in red chalk. Another day, her cat disappeared. She noticed the baker's wife would not look her in the eye at the market. Then came the letter from the magistrate, ordering Clara to appear before the local priest for questioning. She arrived wearing her best dress, hoping her dignity would protect her, but she was met by two strangers in black robes, their faces hidden by wide hats. The questioning began innocently enough, about her husband, about her prayers, about the books in her home. But soon the questions turned to accusations, Did she know spells? Did she gather herbs at night? Did she ever speak against the church? Clara denied everything, but the inquisitors were unmoved. They brought in witnesses, a neighbor who claimed Clara's eyes glowed in the dark, a girl who remembered seeing her in the cemetery at sunset, a merchant who said she once refused to buy holy water. The records show that Clara maintained her composure, insisting on her innocence, even when she was accused of cursing the mayor's son after he fell ill. The inquisitors wrote in their report that she was unyielding, cold, and obstinate, a sign of her pact with the devil. Her cell was cold and damp, the only light a thin bar from a slit high in the wall. Days passed without news, without visitors, without any hope of release. Clara tried to pray, but the words sounded hollow, swallowed by stone. She scratched a tally into the wall for each day, but soon lost count. The guards would not speak to her, except to mock her or to toss a crust of bread through the bars. At night, she heard the screams of other prisoners, men and women, some young, some old, all broken by the process that would follow. The interrogations became more intense. The inquisitors brought in a midwife to search Clara's body for the witch's mark, poking and prodding while the guards watched and laughed. They threatened her with the pear of anguish, with the rack, with burning. When she refused to confess, they brought her neighbor, an old friend, into the cell, threatening to torture her as well unless Clara admitted her guilt. The records show that Clara finally broke, not for herself, but to spare her friend. She confessed to everything, to cursing crops, to meeting with other witches, to casting evil eyes on children. The confession was written down, signed with a shaking hand. But the confession was not the end. It only opened the door for more accusations, more names, more investigations. The inquisitors demanded that Clara name others, to describe secret gatherings that never happened, to draw a map of the supposed coven's meeting place. The city began to unravel, friends turning on friends, families torn apart by suspicion. Clara's name was read aloud in the cathedral as a warning to all, a lesson in what happens to those who do not obey, who do not fit in, who do not bend to the will of the powerful. Her sentence was public humiliation, a march through the square wearing a sackcloth robe and a sign around her neck that read, "Heretic." The people of Cordoba watched in silence, some with pity, most with fear. The records end with Clara being sent to a convent for life, her home and belongings seized by the court, her name spoken only in whispers for generations. Another case that left its mark on the archives is that of Mateo Ramos, a young apprentice blacksmith in Granada. Mateo was barely 17, known for his easy smile and strong arms. He fell in love with a girl whose family had recently arrived from Portugal, and their romance became the subject of gossip. When a series of thefts plagued the city, someone accused the newcomers of being secret Jews, of hiding old faiths beneath new names. Mateo was caught defending his beloved's honor in the marketplace, and that was all it took. He was arrested, interrogated, and asked to denounce her and her family. Mateo's refusal brought down the full weight of the Inquisition. The records describe the use of the strapado, the rack, and days without food or water. He held out as long as he could, but the fear that his silence would cost his beloved's life broke him in the end. He confessed, recanted, confessed again, the details blurring as his mind and body failed. His confession was used to arrest not only his beloved and her parents, but 2 more families on the same street. The trial lasted months. Some were released, most lost their homes and livelihoods, and a few disappeared into prisons and never returned. There is a darker story buried in the archives from Barcelona, a case with no ending, only rumors. It is the story of Esteban Duarte, a priest who became an outspoken critic of the Inquisition itself. Esteban was admired for his sermons about mercy, for his willingness to help the poor, for his belief that confession should come from the heart, not the rack. In 1680, a fellow priest denounced Esteban, accusing him of dangerous leniency, of reading forbidden texts from Italy, of encouraging compassion for those already condemned. Esteban's trial is remarkable for its complexity. The documents are full of contradictions. Some witnesses claim he worked miracles, others say he questioned the nature of sin. The inquisitors searched his rooms, finding letters from scholars and marginal notes in his Bible. They interrogated him for months, but Esteban remained calm, always returning to the words of Christ: forgiveness, patience, love. The records show that even some inquisitors were moved by his dignity. But the pressure was too great. In the end, Esteban was excommunicated, sent to a remote monastery, his books burned in the square. Years later, stories would circulate that he continued to preach in secret, gathering followers who believed that mercy was the true test of faith. The real terror of the Inquisition was not only in the sentences or the torture chambers, but in the way suspicion became contagious. Documents from villages in Castile and Aragon reveal how quickly a simple dispute, a boundary argument, a failed harvest, a jealous lover, could erupt into accusations of heresy, sorcery, or worse. The machinery of the Inquisition was designed to grind slowly, to wear down resistance, to make examples of the unlucky. There is the case of Manuel Ruiz, a baker in Salamanca, whose only crime was refusing to raise his prices when the harvest failed. A rival accused him of consorting with Jews, of baking bread on the wrong days, of saying a prayer in a foreign tongue. Manuel was arrested, his family forced to watch as he was dragged through the streets. The records are clear. He was innocent. But the process was the same: isolation, questioning, forced confession, and in the end, a ruined life. What connects all these stories is not just the pain or the cruelty, but the randomness. The Inquisition claimed to be about order and faith, but in reality, it was about fear of difference, of the unknown, of change. Anyone could become a victim: a widow, a lover, a priest, a baker. The only certainty was that no one was safe. When you walk through the old cities now, you might see a plaque on a wall, a faded name in a church register, a hollow in the cobblestones where a scaffold once stood. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of voices. Clara's calm defiance, Mateo's desperate love, Esteban's faith, Manuel's bewilderment. Their stories remind us that justice without mercy becomes its own kind of heresy, and that the past is never as far away as we like to imagine. There are stories in the Inquisition's archives that are almost too strange to believe. Stories that stretch the bounds of fear and injustice until they break. In every region, from the bustling cities of the coast to the silent mountain villages, the same pattern repeats. A single accusation, a rumor, and then the slow, crushing machinery of investigation. Yet each story, though it follows the same steps, is different in its heartbreak, its twists, its human details. In the Basque country, among the mist and stone, there was a case that haunted the region for generations. The trial of Antonia Iriart, a healer and herbalist whose family had lived in the hills for centuries. The people of her village trusted her. She delivered babies, set bones, and brewed teas for every ailment. For a long time, her skills were respected, even sought after by the local priest, who would sometimes come quietly at night when his own ailments troubled him. But then came a year of famine and storms. The river burst its banks, fields drowned, and sickness spread like wildfire. The villagers, desperate for answers, turned their suspicions toward Antonia. Someone claimed to have seen her walking in the woods by moonlight, gathering strange plants. A child had died after taking her medicine, and his grieving mother pointed the finger. The rumors grew, each retelling darker and more fevered. When the bishop's men arrived, they found a village already braced for a purge. Antonia was taken from her home at dawn, her hands bound, her face hidden beneath a shawl. The men tore through her house, searching for proof, dried herbs, jars of oil, a wooden idol carved by her grandfather. All of it was laid out on a table as evidence. Her trial was held in the old church, the pews packed with villagers who once called her friend. The records say Antonia refused to confess, even as the questioning grew harsher. She was accused not just of sorcery, but of poisoning wells, of summoning storms, of meeting with the devil himself. The testimony is preserved in yellowed pages, the bishop's questions, the replies, the silences. Antonia's strength is remarkable. She never weeps, never begs. Instead, she speaks about her craft, about the power of roots and leaves, about the ancient ways handed down from mother to daughter. But the inquisitors are not interested in knowledge or healing. They demand names, details, rituals. She refuses. They take her to the prison, where the torment begins, not just the rack, but days in darkness, hunger, endless questions. The priests come to her cell and chant prayers, sprinkling holy water, insisting that the only path to mercy is confession. Her resistance becomes a legend among the other prisoners. Some whisper her name at night, drawing strength from her stubbornness. Others fear that she is only making things worse, that every day she refuses is another day of suffering for them all. When Antonia finally breaks, after months of isolation and humiliation, her confession is little more than a recitation of the accusations they put in her mouth. She names no one, invents no rituals, gives only what is demanded. Her sentence is exile, her property confiscated, her name cursed in the village that once cherished her. In the same records, only a few pages away, is the story of a priest named Tomás de Valina. whose faith was tested not by the rack, but by his own conscience. Tamaz was a scholar, a gentle man who loved books and spent more time with the poor than with the powerful. He questioned the excesses of the church, wondered aloud if mercy was more important than punishment. When a young boy was accused of theft and heresy, Tamaz intervened, arguing for compassion, insisting that a child could not be a heretic. That was all it took. His rivals in the chapter house saw an opportunity. Rumors spread. Tamaz read banned books. Tamaz spent too much time alone. Tamaz spoke kindly of Jews and Muslims. The inquisitors opened a file. Tamaz was summoned for questioning. At first, he believed his honesty would save him, that his reputation and learning would shield him. But the process was the same as always. The questions became accusations. The accusations became proof. Tamaz's friends vanished, afraid to be seen at his side. Alone, Tamaz faced his judges. He refused to confess to things he did not believe. The documents show his handwriting, firm at first, then shakier as the weeks wore on. He wrote letters to Rome, to his family, to anyone who might intervene, but no help came. In the end, Tamaz was condemned not for heresy, but for pride, for refusing to bow to the authority of the Inquisition. He spent his last years in a small, distant parish, his sermons closely monitored, his books censored. Yet, decades later, people still remembered his kindness. The way he would sneak food to hungry children. The way he never stopped teaching that love was stronger than fear. Another file, this time from Valencia, details the fate of a family who became collateral damage in a neighborhood feud. The Morales family had done well for themselves, opening a small shop, sending their children to school. Their neighbor, envious and embittered by old arguments over property lines, began to spread rumors that the Moraleses did not attend Mass regularly, that their eldest daughter was seen speaking to a foreign merchant. In a city on edge, it did not take much. The father, Miguel, was arrested first, accused of harboring heretical books. His wife, Juana, was taken soon after, questioned about her childhood, her prayers, her friends. The trial unfolded over months. Neighbors were called to testify. Some spoke the truth, others repeated the rumors, afraid of what would happen if they seemed sympathetic. The children were left to beg for food. Miguel, under torture, confessed to owning books he had never seen. Juana was accused of Judaizing after an old family recipe was found in her kitchen. In the end, the Moraleses were exiled, their property auctioned, their story recorded in the dry language of court documents. Case concluded, property seized, sentence executed. The cruelty lay not only in the loss, but in the banality. Their lives, hopes, and dreams reduced to a few lines in a ledger. There are lighter stories, too, moments when the machine faltered, when ordinary people risked everything to save a neighbor. In a small village near Segovia, an old woman named Teresa was accused after an outbreak of sickness. Her closest friend, a farmer named Alonso, stood before the inquisitors and swore on his life that Teresa was innocent, that she had saved his son from fever, that she prayed every day for the village. His courage inspired others. The villagers, for once, refused to cooperate, closing ranks around Teresa. The inquisitors, finding no evidence, eventually left empty-handed, their power shaken by a rare display of solidarity. But such victories were rare. Most cases ended not with justice, but with silence and loss. In every town there were empty houses, forgotten graves, families who disappeared without explanation. The records show the scale, thousands of names, each one a story. Yet for every name, there were 10 more who lived in fear, who learned to be careful with their words, who watched the shadows for signs that the Inquisition had returned. Sometimes in the faded ink and brittle paper, a detail shines through. A line of poetry scrawled in the margin, a pressed flower hidden between pages, a note from a child to a parent. These small fragments are proof that even in the darkest times, people found ways to hold on to beauty, to kindness, to hope. They remind us that history is not just a record of cruelty, but also of endurance, of the quiet courage it takes to survive and remember. When you visit those old towns now, you might see the ruins of the Inquisition's prisons, the arches of abandoned churches, the names carved in stone. But what lingers longest is the memory of the victims, Antonia, Tomás, the Morales family, Teresa, and the lessons their stories still whisper. That fear can be weaponized, that power seeks to divide, and that even a single act of courage can echo for centuries. The story of the Inquisition is often told through the eyes of its victims, but just as haunting are the shadows behind the curtain. The men who designed, directed, and delighted in the machinery of terror. These inquisitors were not faceless judges or nameless priests. They were men of flesh and blood, driven by motives as varied as their victims. Some believed in the cause. Some craved power. Some, history remembers only too well, found a sick kind of pleasure in the suffering of others. Their corruption did not just poison the courts. It infected the soul of an entire era. Consider the notorious figure of Tomás de Torquemada, a name still spoken with a shudder centuries after his death. Torquemada rose to power as the first Grand Inquisitor of Spain, wielding his authority like a blade. He built a network of informants, paid spies and local priests to keep watch on every household, every conversation. Officially, he was a servant of God, tasked with protecting the faith. Unofficially, he became a master of intrigue, using threats and promises to secure confessions and to settle personal scores. His own correspondence, preserved in dusty archives, reveals a mind obsessed with purity, not just of faith, but of lineage, blood, and loyalty to the crown. But beneath the grand speeches and the solemn robes, corruption thrived. There are records of gold exchanged for mercy, of enemies paying to have rivals investigated or cleared. Torquemada's network was oiled by bribes, and the wealth of his office grew with every confiscated estate. The line between religious duty and personal gain blurred until it vanished completely. The richer the accused, the harsher the trial, for every guilty verdict meant lands and gold for the Inquisition's coffers. Even the king turned a blind eye, content to see his enemies ruined and his treasury fattened. Yet Torquemada was not unique. In the city of Zaragoza, there lived a man named Father Rodrigo Salvatierra, a priest whose name became synonymous with cruelty. Rodrigo was clever, charming, and utterly ruthless. He would visit the cells at night, whispering promises of freedom to frightened prisoners in exchange for information, real or invented. Some he let go if their families paid enough. Others he kept for his own pleasure, prolonging interrogations for days, savoring the breaking of spirit and bone. Witnesses described his laugh echoing down the corridors, his jokes about the art of pain. He invented new methods of torment, always with a thin veil of justification. It was for the soul's salvation, he claimed, though no one believed it. Rodrigo's case files tell the story of a man drunk on power. In one notorious instance, he falsified evidence against a rival who had insulted him at a banquet. He paid witnesses to swear they had seen the man consorting with heretics. When the accused protested his innocence, Rodrigo staged a public confession, using threats against the man's family. The trial was a farce, the punishment inevitable. Rodrigo later acquired the man's house at a suspiciously low price, claiming it as payment for his faithful service. Such abuses were not limited to Spain. In the Portuguese Inquisition, a figure named Antonio Gonçalves de Silva rose quickly through the ranks, his reputation built on efficiency and results. Antonio was famous for his light touch in the courtroom and for his heavy hand in the torture chamber. Documents reveal a pattern. Prisoners who could pay were offered leniency, a chance to recant and go free. Those without means, especially the poor and the marginalized, were left to rot or perish in agony. It was an open secret that Antonio kept a ledger of debts, tracking who owed what for their freedom. Some paid in gold, others in favors. More than once, a young servant or desperate widow found herself summoned for private penance behind closed doors. The system itself invited corruption. The inquisitors lived in fine houses, dined on confiscated goods, and traveled with entourages of guards and servants. Their power was absolute, unchecked by law, answerable only to distant superiors who were often just as corrupt. Accusations could be fabricated, confessions extracted by any means necessary. To oppose an inquisitor was to risk everything: property, reputation, even life. Stories circulated of inquisitors who took pleasure in the pain they inflicted. There was Don Diego de Estrada, nicknamed the Smiler for his habit of grinning as he turned the screws on the rack. Prisoners dreaded the sound of his footsteps. Survivors spoke of his cold questions, his way of leaning close, his eyes bright with anticipation as a victim neared the breaking point. He was said to keep trophies, locks of hair, scraps of clothing, mementos of those he had purified. Once, he had a portrait painted of himself beside the Iron Maiden, his hand resting on its spiked door, the inscription below reading, "The path to salvation is narrow and sharp." These men were not monsters in the sense of fables or nightmares. They were men shaped by a world that rewarded cruelty and secrecy. Some entered the Inquisition as true believers, convinced they were saving souls. But power twists the mind. The records are full of confessions taken under duress, of verdicts altered by bribes, of punishments meted out not for sin, but for profit or pleasure. There were inquisitors who tried to resist the tide, men who quietly warned prisoners, who sabotaged trials, who smuggled notes of hope to those in the cells. But they were few, and most learned to hide their mercy or were removed by those above them. The institution valued results, not justice. In the end, the greatest corruption was not only in the gold changing hands or the properties seized, but in the soul of the Inquisition itself. The torture, the lies, the abuse of power, all were justified in the name of faith. And so the cruelty multiplied, feeding on itself like a fire that could never be quenched. The records show that, as the years passed, the inquisitors became more cynical, more hardened. What began as a mission to save souls became a contest for prestige and wealth. A theater of sadism played out behind locked doors. And yet the victims remembered. Long after the inquisitors died and their names faded from official rolls, the stories lingered in villages and cities. Mothers warned their children not to trust a smiling priest. Survivors whispered of men who wore the cross but spoke with the tongue of a snake. In every broken family, in every ruined home, in every name scratched from the records, the true nature of the Inquisition's corruption lived on, a warning, and a wound that never truly healed. In the annals of the Inquisition, the names of its infamous inquisitors form a grotesque gallery. Some wielded power like a sledgehammer, others preferred a slow, meticulous approach. But all were united by a system that allowed, even encouraged, their darkest instincts to thrive. Behind the closed doors of grand offices and echoing torture chambers, the line between justice and personal indulgence disappeared, replaced by something far more primal and dangerous. In Seville, the story of Inquisitor Hernando del Val became a cautionary tale whispered for generations. Hernando was not born into the church. He came from a family of minor nobility, ambitious and clever, always hungry for more. He began his career as a notary, quickly learning that information was the most valuable currency in the city. His rise through the ecclesiastical ranks was swift, helped by timely gifts to his superiors and ruthless deals with powerful merchants. When he was appointed to the Inquisition, he brought with him a network of spies, debtors, and informants ready to do his bidding. Hernando's reign was marked by an uncanny ability to find heresy where none seemed to exist, and to profit handsomely from it. It was said that if you had gold, you could make your troubles vanish. But if you crossed him or refused his demands, your life could unravel overnight. Records from Seville show a pattern. Those who failed to pay a requested sum would suddenly find themselves accused of harboring forbidden texts or associating with suspected witches. Neighbors would testify, sometimes after receiving a purse of silver. Evidence would appear, witnesses would be pressured, and a confession, usually extracted after days of torture, would seal the matter. Hernando became rich, amassing land and jewels while his victims' homes were auctioned at cut-rate prices to friends and allies. The corruption did not stop at money. Hernando delighted in psychological games, targeting rivals and outspoken critics with whispered rumors. He was fond of visiting his prisoners in their cells, not just to threaten or interrogate, but to study them, to savor their despair. He kept detailed notes describing which methods of torture produced tears, which left the mind broken, which prompted hysterical laughter. His cruelty was never random. He saw himself as an artist of pain, shaping souls in fire and fear. Even other inquisitors, hardened as they were, kept their distance. One notorious case involved a wealthy widow, Doña Estefania, who had refused Hernando's proposal of marriage years earlier. Suddenly, she found herself accused of consorting with Moriscos, of reading poetry in a language unknown to the court. The trial was a spectacle. Evidence fabricated, servants bribed, neighbors silenced. Doña Estefania's lands were seized, her reputation destroyed, her children scattered. Hernando acquired her estate for a fraction of its value, and was later seen wearing a ring said to have belonged to her late husband. Stories like these echoed across the Iberian Peninsula. In Lisbon, Inquisitor João Pires was notorious for running what amounted to a protection racket. Families who could afford to pay found themselves shielded from accusations. Those who could not, or who hesitated, were swiftly denounced. João was known for his Black Ledger, a hidden book listing the names of those who paid him in gold, artwork, even rare books, all in exchange for safety. The threat was always implied. Accidents happened, evidence appeared, memories became unreliable. But João was more than a corrupt official. He enjoyed the power, the groveling of the wealthy at his feet, the terror in the eyes of men who had once mocked him. His downfall, when it came, was almost cinematic. A rival inquisitor, envious of João's influence, launched a secret investigation. The ledger was discovered. João was disgraced, exiled, his own fortune confiscated by the same system he had abused. Yet for every João who fell, 3 more rose to take his place, each learning from his mistakes, each determined to cover his tracks more thoroughly. There were inquisitors whose interests strayed into sadism for its own sake. Gaspar del Corral, a name still cursed in Aragon, was infamous not only for his brutality, but for his perverse rituals. Witness accounts, buried deep in trial records, describe late-night sessions where Gaspar would gather trusted guards and a few select guests, making a spectacle of public torture for entertainment. It was not just about confessions or justice. It was about pleasure, about dominating those who were helpless, about feeding a hunger that could never be satisfied. Survivors, if they lived, spoke of Gaspar's laughter, of his hands lingering on the tools of pain, of the way he would invent new reasons for another round of torment. Gaspar's home was filled with souvenirs, bits of rope, splinters from the rack, iron keys that never fit any lock. He was a collector of pain, a curator of suffering. There are even stories that he commissioned poems and paintings celebrating his exploits. A twisted cult of personality that grew with every victim. When the Bishop of Aragon finally acted, it was not out of compassion, but out of fear that Gaspar's excesses would bring shame upon the institution. Even then, Gaspar faced only a mild rebuke, quietly retired to a remote estate, his crimes never publicly acknowledged. But not all inquisitors were monsters from the start. Some entered the system with honest intentions, only to be twisted by its logic. There is the tragic example of Father Lorenzo Morales, once a gentle teacher, beloved by his flock. At first, he tried to spare the accused, urging compassion, offering private penance instead of public ruin. But as his career advanced, the pressure to produce results mounted. Superiors demanded confessions, quotas, names. Father Lorenzo began to compromise, a gentle hint here, a suggestion there, a signature on a document he had not read. Little by little, he found himself complicit in injustices he would once have condemned. His sermons grew harsher, his prayers more desperate. Eventually, Father Lorenzo withdrew from public life, tormented by guilt, warning his successor in a letter, "Beware the slow poison of power. It turns mercy to stone." The machinery of corruption extended beyond individuals. Entire families of inquisitors developed reputations for cruelty and greed, passing down secrets and connections through generations. Some city councils learned to bargain with their inquisitors, offering support in exchange for favors or turning a blind eye to certain crimes. The Church, officially devoted to rooting out sin, became itself a shelter for vice, protected by secrecy and the threat of damnation. Perhaps the greatest cruelty was how easily the system adapted. When public opinion grew restive, inquisitors would stage dramatic acts of mercy, pardoning a few high-profile prisoners, returning confiscated goods, even allowing a staged apology from a penitent noble. These displays did little to change the reality. The money kept flowing, the innocent kept suffering, and the most dangerous inquisitors became ever more cunning, hiding their vices beneath a mask of piety. Even after the worst excesses faded, the damage remained. Generations grew up knowing that survival depended on silence, on paying the right bribe, on never attracting the attention of the wrong man in black. Trust eroded, families splintered, villages lost their sense of safety. The legacies of Hernando, Joel, Gaspar, and countless others outlived them, turning the very idea of justice into something to be feared. The survivors remembered, and so did their children. In whispered stories and secret diaries, they left warnings for the future. Never trust unchecked power. Never believe that cruelty can serve a higher good. Never forget that behind every system, no matter how sacred, are people. And it is in people that both corruption and hope will always live. The further you look into the archives and the private letters, the more you see that the rot of corruption ran deeper than anyone at the time dared to admit. It was not simply a handful of monstrous men, but a whole society woven through with fear, greed, and the seductive thrill of unchecked authority. The Inquisition became, over decades, a world unto itself, with its own rules, secrets, and economy of favors and betrayals. In the city of Valladolid, the rise of Inquisitor Alonso de la Peña offers a case study in how cruelty and ambition became the pillars of this hidden world. Alonso did not come from privilege or even a particularly devout family. He was clever, observant, and ruthless in a way that impressed his mentors. From the start, he saw the Inquisition as not just a calling, but an opportunity. He watched as older inquisitors turned every case into profit, learning which accusations yielded the most lucrative confiscations, which families would pay quietly to avoid disgrace, which rivals might be undermined by a well-placed rumor. He was a master at exploiting the gray areas of the law. The rules of evidence, already flexible, became to Alonso a set of suggestions, not requirements. If a merchant had land Alonso coveted, soon a servant or jealous neighbor would be found ready to testify that the merchant said something blasphemous after too much wine. If a widow's house lay in a prime location, it was only a matter of time before a concerned parishioner reported her for secretly lighting candles to strange saints. Alonso would present himself as the tireless defender of the faith, his hands seemingly clean, even as his fortune grew. Alonso's reputation for ferocity spread beyond Valladolid. He became a man people feared to cross. Prisoners accused under his watch faced a choice: pay a bribe and hope for leniency, or hold fast and endure every cruelty. Documents from his tenure reveal an elaborate system of fees, with agents collecting payments on his behalf and laundering them through church charities. Those who could not pay found themselves subjected to the worst torments in the inquisitorial arsenal. The cruelty was justified with a litany of official language, for the purity of faith, to save souls from darkness. But everyone knew it was about power and about keeping the wheels of fear turning. His favorite method was psychological terror. Alonso believed that true control meant not just breaking the body, but owning the mind. He would drag trials out for months, keeping the accused in the dark, threatening families, demanding that neighbors betray one another. He orchestrated public displays of mercy, sparing a weeping mother in exchange for a full confession that implicated a dozen more. He wrote sermons warning of spiritual contagion, planting the seeds of suspicion everywhere. By the end of his reign, Valladolid was a city of whispers, where people crossed the street to avoid old friends, and no one dared speak above a murmur. It wasn't just gold and land that tempted inquisitors. Some, like Alonso's associate Pedro Galvan, saw themselves as above morality entirely, their own desires sanctified by their holy office. Pedro's passion was for secret punishments, inflicted in private acts that left no visible wounds, but destroyed reputations and futures. He kept files of gossip, blackmail material, secret love affairs and debts, ready to use against anyone who might one day challenge him or simply offend his pride. He had a favorite target, a respected doctor named Martin Salazar. Martin had treated Pedro's daughter for an illness, and when she recovered, refused Pedro's demand for a discount. Months later, the doctor found himself accused of sorcery, his house searched, his reputation shattered. Pedro leaked rumors that Martin had learned his trade from Jews expelled years before, that he kept forbidden books and practiced dark rituals at night. Even as Martin protested his innocence, he found patients turning away, friends refusing to speak to him. Pedro needed no evidence to destroy a life, only the power of suggestion and the certainty that fear would do the rest. The cycle was self-sustaining. Inquisitors learned to protect one another to cover up scandals and mistakes. If a member of their circle was exposed, caught taking bribes, accused of a crime himself, the others would rally, burying evidence, silencing witnesses, shifting blame to a convenient scapegoat. When word reached the crown or the higher authorities in Rome, the most that happened was a quiet transfer, a forced retirement, a few years in exile at a comfortable estate. The system was never truly threatened, because it served too many interests. Those of the crown, those of the church, and those of the men who had made a fortune selling mercy and manufacturing terror. But even within this world, there were lines that some refused to cross. Father Vicent Monreal was one of the rare inquisitors who tried to fight the current. He arrived in Valladolid with a reputation for compassion and a determination to do things differently. He refused bribes, insisted on proper evidence, and offered real penance instead of punishment whenever possible. At first, the people hoped for change, but the other inquisitors saw Vicent as a threat not just to their profits, but to the entire order. They began to spread rumors of their own. That Vicent was too soft, that he protected heretics, that his own mother had been seen lighting candles in a suspicious way. The campaign of whispers and threats escalated. Eventually, Vicent found himself accused of neglecting his duty, of consorting with known sinners. His own staff, terrified of losing their positions, testified against him. His trial was swift and merciless, a mockery of justice. Vicent was banished, his reputation ruined. The other inquisitors returned to business as usual, their victory complete. The most chilling aspect of the Inquisition's corruption was how it warped ordinary people. Not every inquisitor was a villain by nature. Many entered the order with dreams of serving God and saving souls, believing the rhetoric about faith and purity. But over time, the pressure to produce results, the constant exposure to suffering, and the normalization of cruelty changed them. Some became numb, going through the motions without feeling. Others embraced their roles, finding meaning in the power they wielded. A few lost themselves completely, becoming the very monsters they were supposed to hunt. And then there were those who watched from the sidelines, clerks, scribes, guards, the families of the accused. They too were drawn into the system, forced to choose between conscience and survival. Some tried to resist, slipping food to prisoners or warning families of impending raids. But most, fearing for their lives, learned to look away, to keep silent, to let the machinery of pain grind on. In the end, the Inquisition became a mirror for the darkest parts of human nature. The desire for control, the lure of easy profit, the satisfaction of vengeance disguised as justice. It showed how a righteous cause, stripped of mercy and accountability, can become a cover for the worst kinds of cruelty. The inquisitors who survived longest were not necessarily the cleverest or the bravest, but those most skilled at justifying their actions, at hiding behind holy words while pursuing very earthly pleasures. Long after the bells of Valladolid fell silent and the records gathered dust, the scars remained. Inquisitors like Alonso and Pedro vanished from official history, but the fear they created lingered, passed down in stories, in warnings whispered to children. in the instinct to distrust those who claim too much power in the name of good. The true cost of the Inquisition's corruption was not just in gold or land or broken bodies, but in the way it taught a whole generation to see their neighbors as threats, to weigh every kindness against the risk of betrayal, to wonder what anyone, even themselves, might be capable of if the price was right. Centuries have passed since the last autodafé blazed in a Spanish square, since the iron doors of the Inquisitor's court clanged shut behind the condemned. Yet the shadow of the Inquisition lingers, not as a memory consigned to dusty books, but as a living presence in the culture, the courts, and the hearts of people who may never have heard a single victim's name. This is a story about echoes, about how a world built on suspicion and cruelty can shape not just the lives of those who suffered, but the fears and hopes of everyone who comes after. Walk the narrow streets of Seville, Toledo, Lisbon, and you still see the marks. The crumbling towers where guards once kept watch, the faded crosses carved above doorways, the plaques that commemorate the lost. But the deeper scars are invisible, hidden in stories, in habits of mind, in the unspoken rules that survive long after the last Inquisitor's bones have turned to dust. In the centuries after the Inquisition, Spain and Portugal struggled to define themselves. Kings and councils issued edicts declaring the darkness over, promising tolerance and justice. Libraries opened, new laws were written, but for generations, suspicion lingered. People whispered about old families, about purity of blood. In towns across Castile and Aragon, neighbors still hesitated before trusting one another. Marriages were arranged with questions about ancestry, not just love. Some villages kept hidden lists of names. Stories passed from parent to child about who had survived, who had betrayed, who had vanished. The psychological wounds were deep. Inquisition justice was not just about torture chambers. It was about making people doubt themselves, teaching them to watch their words, to weigh every friendship. This legacy did not vanish with the closing of the dungeons. Instead, it crept into the way people thought about authority, about risk, about what could and could not be spoken aloud. Centuries later, writers like Cervantes and Quevedo painted a world where jokes and riddles covered truth, where satire became a shield for the powerless. But the greatest legacy was not just in the mind, but in the law. In the wake of the Inquisition, reformers and philosophers across Europe looked to Spain as a warning. They argued for courts that were open to the public, for judges who could be held accountable, for the right to a fair defense. In England, France, even the newly born United States, lawmakers debated how to build systems where no one could be tortured into confessing, where guilt required evidence, where confession could not be bought or forced. The very idea of innocent until proven guilty, so obvious now, grew out of horror at what happened when justice was secret and unchecked. Still, the pull of darkness remains. In times of fear or crisis, societies are tempted to revive old habits, to look for enemies within, to treat difference as danger, to trust those who promise order at any cost. In the 20th century, new inquisitions appeared in new forms: blacklists, secret police, courts that decided guilt before a word was spoken. Writers and historians drew direct lines back to the Spanish courts, proof that the lessons of the Inquisition had not always been learned. Yet memory itself can be a form of resistance. In the cities and villages that once trembled under the shadow of the cross and the rack, people have begun to tell the stories again. In Seville, the old Inquisitor's palace is now a museum, its rooms filled with testimony from victims, with the names of those who suffered carved into stone. Schools teach the history openly. Playwrights and poets turn old tragedies into acts of remembrance and warning. The legacy of the Inquisition is complex, a mix of fear and resilience, of wounds that never fully heal and lessons that must be relearned. Some families still carry the old secrets, the hush that falls at certain topics, the knowledge that a careless word can echo for centuries. Others have turned the pain into defiance, teaching their children to speak, to question, to refuse the silence that once protected the torturers. And so we come to the question that will not leave us, the one whispered in every age when fear grows and the old doors seem ready to close again. What would you do if you stood before the Inquisitor? Would you stay silent? Would you confess to save yourself or to save someone you love? Would you have the strength to resist? Or would you break like so many before you? This question is not just for the past. It is for now. For every time you are asked to choose between safety and honesty, between comfort and courage, between looking away or looking a lie in the face, the shadow of the Inquisition survives wherever power is unchecked, wherever justice is secret, wherever fear is used as a tool. But so does hope. In the memory of those who suffered, in the names carved in stone, in every law that protects the weak, in every voice that refuses to be silenced, the lesson of the Inquisition endures. We remember not just the darkness, but the ways people fought to survive it, the moments of kindness, the tiny rebellions, the refusal to let pain be the last word. So I ask you now, if you found yourself facing the Inquisitor, what would you do? Would you keep your soul, or would you give it away for the promise of peace? Would you whisper a name, or hold fast to the truth even as the world fell apart? The answer is never easy, but the asking of the question, again and again, from one generation to the next, is what keeps the memory of darkness from swallowing the light. In the years that followed the collapse of the Inquisition's power, Spain, Portugal, and their former colonies all faced the challenge of reckoning with what had happened. It was not just a question of rebuilding institutions or righting specific wrongs. The real wound was deeper, buried in the psyche of millions. People emerged from the long shadow blinking at the sunlight, unsure whom to trust, unsure even of themselves. They carried with them the habits of silence, the reflex to keep secrets, the suspicion that safety lay in never saying what you truly thought. Historians sometimes speak of cultural trauma, a wound so deep it shapes the behavior of whole societies long after the original event is forgotten. In the Iberian world, this trauma had many faces. It lived in the fear that you could lose everything overnight, not just property, but honor, family, even your name. It lived in the way families told stories, or more often, in what they refused to talk about. Children grew up hearing that there were subjects best left untouched, ancestors whose names were never spoken, documents locked away in chests and drawers, only to be destroyed if anyone came asking. Even today, some Spanish and Portuguese families can trace their roots to the conversos, Moriscos, and so-called New Christians, who survived the Inquisition by hiding their origins. For generations, they learned to live with double identities, outwardly faithful, inwardly wary, watching the wind for any shift in power. This legacy, passed down like a whispered warning, helped shape the character of modern Iberia. People became experts at reading between the lines, at understanding what was meant, not just what was said. Irony, double meaning, and indirect speech found their place in literature, art, and daily conversation. It is no accident that the greatest novels of the region, from Don Quixote to the works of Saramago, are full of puzzles, masks, and questions that cannot be answered directly. But the trauma was not just psychological. The very structure of justice changed in response to what people had seen and suffered. The memory of secret tribunals and forced confessions became a rallying cry for reform. Enlightenment thinkers across Europe pointed to the Inquisition as proof that unchecked authority was a danger not only to freedom, but to truth itself. Philosophers like Montesquieu and Voltaire quoted stories of the Inquisition in their arguments for due process, for public trials, for the presumption of innocence. Even in places untouched by Spanish rule, the nightmare of the Inquisition became a symbol for all abuses of power. These debates found their way into the very bones of modern law. In the 19th and 20th centuries, new constitutions and civil codes in Spain, Portugal, and their former colonies enshrined protections against arbitrary arrest and torture. Some courts placed signs above their doors. No one shall be tortured for their beliefs. In Latin America, where the shadow of the Inquisition lingered in different forms, in military juntas, in secret police, in whispered accusations, activists and lawyers invoked the memory of the old terror as a warning. They argued that true justice required not just punishment for crime, but respect for the dignity of every human being, even the accused. Yet culture is stubborn. The ghosts of the Inquisition did not vanish with the stroke of a pen. In some places, old habits died hard. Local officials, police, even teachers might still use shame and fear as tools to keep order. Families passed down tales of betrayal, warning their children never to trust the powerful, never to confess to anything if accused. This wariness helped explain why some of the greatest revolutions of the modern world, from the Spanish Civil War to the Portuguese Carnation Revolution, were marked not only by violence, but by an explosion of long-suppressed stories. When the old regime finally fell, people rushed to fill the silence with voices that had been stifled for centuries. In art, the Inquisition left a mark that is still visible today. Painters and playwrights returned again and again to the image of the accused before the judges, the lone figure facing the faceless power, the courage and terror that scene evokes. From Goya's black paintings to the films of Almodovar, artists used the language of trauma to explore what happens when society is built on fear. Museums that were once centers of cruelty became places of memory. Schoolchildren visit the cells where the innocent once waited for judgment. Names once erased are restored in stone, in books, in ceremonies of public remembrance. But memory is not just about suffering. In many ways, the true legacy of the Inquisition is found in acts of resistance, both small and grand. The tradition of satirical humor, the stubbornness of the peasant who keeps a forbidden book, the survivor who teaches her grandchildren to ask questions. All these are answers to the darkness. People learned that when the truth was dangerous, it had to be hidden, encoded, protected. But they also learned to treasure it, to hold it as something sacred, even when it could not be spoken aloud. This is why in modern Spain and Portugal there is such a fierce debate over history, over what should be taught, what should be remembered, what must never be forgotten. For every movement to reclaim the memory of the victims, there are voices urging caution, calling for reconciliation, warning against stirring up old divisions. The question hangs in the air, never fully resolved. How do you honor the past without letting it poison the present? Perhaps the best answer is found not in laws or monuments, but in the private moments that shape character. In the child who dares to ask a forbidden question. In the teacher who encourages curiosity even if the answer is uncomfortable. In the friend who stands by you when rumors swirl. In the parent who tells the truth even when it is painful. The shadow of the Inquisition teaches that cruelty thrives when people are silent, when they accept what they know to be wrong, when they allow fear to make their choices for them. Let us pause here and turn the question toward you, the listener. Imagine just for a moment that you are living in that time, walking those old streets. Imagine the knock at your door, the summons to court, the cold eyes of the Inquisitor. Would you speak? Would you stay silent? Would you risk everything for a friend, or save yourself and your family by saying what they want to hear? There is no easy answer, no shame in fear. But history shows us that even the smallest act of courage, a word, a gesture, a refusal to betray, can send ripples through time. That is why the memory of the Inquisition remains so powerful. It is not just about what happened, but about the choices that people faced, and the choices we still face today. When you see injustice, do you speak? When you hear a rumor, do you pass it on or let it die? When you find yourself afraid, do you let fear rule you, or do you search for another way? These questions are the real legacy of the Inquisition. They are the reason we tell these stories, the reason we carve names in stone and teach children the truth. For every age invents its own forms of cruelty and fear. But every age also gives birth to new acts of defiance, new ways to protect hope. So what would you do, standing in that room, staring into the eyes of the Inquisitor? Would you choose silence, or would you choose truth, knowing the cost? And what does your answer say about the world we have inherited from those who came before? There are wounds in history that never fully heal. And the Inquisition left its mark not just on those who lived through its terror, but on everyone who came after. For centuries, the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions shaped the very fabric of their societies. How people trusted, how they loved, how they remembered. And even now, in the 21st century, the echoes can still be heard, not just in museums or school books, but in the stories families tell at the kitchen table, in the jokes people share to skirt around fear, and in the subtle ways suspicion lingers at the edges of daily life. When you travel across Spain or Portugal today, the traces of that time appear in unexpected places. A street in Cordoba still bears the name of a family erased from memory, though no one alive remembers why. In Lisbon, the old inquisitorial palace has been turned into a library. The stones beneath your feet worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, both of the powerful and the powerless. There are festivals in some towns to honor the return of families exiled generations ago. Their descendants invited to light candles for ancestors who died unnamed and unmourned. But perhaps the deepest legacy of the Inquisition is not in monuments or names, but in the way people navigate power and authority. Generations taught their children to listen carefully, to weigh every word, to read between the lines. This subtle art of self-protection became second nature. Do not speak too loudly in public. Do not trust every promise. Always keep a little of yourself hidden. Even when democracy returned, even as constitutions declared new freedoms, these habits lingered like a shadow. Psychologists and sociologists in modern Spain have traced this legacy, finding that children are still sometimes taught not to stand out, not to question too boldly, because somewhere deep in the collective memory is the lesson. The tallest tree is the first to be cut down. You see this in art and literature, in the bittersweet humor of the Spanish Esperanto, in the dark irony of Portuguese poetry. Writers and filmmakers circle back again and again to themes of betrayal, silence, survival. Goya's black paintings stare down from museum walls, their figures twisted in agony and defiance, daring the viewer to look away. Novelists like Antonio Muñoz Molina and Saramago probe at the wounds left by secret informers, at families fractured by old fears. Even children's stories whisper warnings. Trust is precious, secrets can be dangerous, and sometimes the world is not as it seems. But the story is not only one of fear. There is also a fierce pride in survival, in the ways people learned to resist, to endure, to keep a spark of hope alive even when everything seemed lost. Grandmothers in Andalusia still pass down recipes and songs in dialects banned centuries ago. In Jewish communities returning to Portugal after hundreds of years in exile, old prayers are spoken again, and the names of the lost are sung beneath the same stars. Each act of memory, each word reclaimed, is a victory over silence. In courtrooms across Europe and the Americas, the specter of the Inquisition hovers whenever justice is debated. The principles born out of that darkness, public trials, the right to remain silent, the presumption of innocence, are now taken for granted. Yet, whenever these principles are threatened, historians and judges alike recall the lesson. Secret justice is no justice at all. In international law, the ban on torture and the defense of human rights are legacies not only of Enlightenment philosophy, but of centuries of pain and resistance. Every time a court rules that evidence extracted by torture is invalid, the ghost of an inquisitor loses a little more of its power. Still, memory is a living thing. In the aftermath of the Franco dictatorship, Spain struggled to come to terms with a new kind of inquisition, the fear and secrecy of another era. Writers and survivors of political prisons drew direct comparisons to the old courts. The silence of neighbors, the pressure to confess, the endless fear of being named. For many families, the trauma of the 20th century awakened older memories, stories their grandparents had only whispered in the dark. It was not easy to break the habit of silence, but a new generation began to insist on truth, truth about the past, truth in the present, truth as the only defense against future cruelty. And so, in recent decades, there has been a flowering of remembrance. Schoolchildren in Toledo trace the route of condemned prisoners from cell to scaffold. Descendants of conversos light Hanukkah candles for the first time in their ancestral homeland. Artists stage plays and exhibitions exploring what it means to be accused, what it means to forgive, what it means to build a world where everyone can speak without fear. The conversation is not always easy. There are still debates, still moments of discomfort, still wounds that ache when touched. But the very act of remembering, of speaking aloud what was once forbidden, is a kind of healing. Here, in the present, the question remains: what do we do with this legacy? How do we honor the suffering without becoming trapped by it? How do we ensure that our systems of justice remain open, fair, and human? These are not questions for historians alone, but for everyone who values freedom and dignity. For every society, there are always moments when fear returns, when it becomes tempting to trust the loudest voice, the promise of safety at the expense of truth. The lesson of the Inquisition is that no society is immune, that the machinery of suspicion can return in new forms. Unless we remember, unless we keep watch. So let me ask you again. Imagine you were there, called before the Inquisitors. Would you confess? Would you name a neighbor? Would you keep silent? Or would you try, against all odds, to hold onto what you know is right? These questions are not meant to accuse, but to invite empathy, to remind us that the victims of history were ordinary people, with ordinary hopes and fears, forced to make impossible choices. And maybe the final lesson is this, that every act of courage, no matter how small, matters. The woman who hid a forbidden book, the priest who smuggled a letter, the child who refused to betray a friend, these are the heroes who changed the world, even if their names were never written down. We remember them not only for what they suffered, but for what they made possible. A world where justice is never perfect, but where hope and memory continue to guide us toward something better. As you listen to this, take a moment to reflect not just on the pain, but on the resilience that rises from it. Ask yourself, what kind of world do you want to leave behind? How will you use your voice, your choices, your memory? For the story of the Inquisition is not over. It lives in every decision to speak out, every refusal to let fear win, every act of remembrance. And that, perhaps, is the greatest victory over darkness of all.